Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've read this week. And it's been a fun one in terms of books. I've had a lot of commuting and so I've managed to get through a fair few. And particularly a bit of a mix of the Women's Prize and a few other sort of books here and there. So let's get started. First up, a brand new release, and that's Small World by Caleb Azumah Nelson. And I really enjoyed Open Water that he released a couple of years ago. And this book does some kind of similar things in some ways, and also brings a little bit of new stuff to the table as well. So essentially the core idea of Small Worlds is quite a lilting, quite a subtle novel at times in a really beautiful way. It talks a lot about music and love, and it's kind of got this real beauty to it in that sense. But then it also deals with some really hard-hitting politics, particularly from the UK. So, for example, we sort of see these sort of family relationships, sort of father and son. We see these beautiful relationships between people in terms of just, these sort of romantic relationships that sort of are starting up and all of these sorts of things, and really, really beautiful and pretty. And then suddenly in this book we have we're sort of forced as a reader to engage with something really quite tricky and horrifying, which is the case of Mark Duggan, who for those of you outside the UK, essentially a few years back he was sort of killed by police, and that was one of those things that sparked a lot of debate and particularly sort of riots and protests around the kind of unfair treatment, because it basically, kind of like with sort of other protests that we've seen in recent years, it kind of revivified, I guess, this sense of, hey, look, we know that things are really unjust and people have been kind of holding it down for a while and really not wanting to have to really go for it, but here we are. And that is a lot of what happened. And it was a really particularly scary time in many ways for many groups of people. But particularly, you know, police injustice was a big part of that. So yeah, this book does this really beautiful thing, I think, of engaging with that in a really meaningful and poignant way, and having that as an important backdrop within the story. But it also, and it gives it, I think, enough space, but it also allows this novel to breathe. And I think it's credit to Caleb Azumah Nelson's writing that he's managed to still create this really beautiful narrative despite some of these horrifying things that are happening in the backdrop of this book. And so what I think I really appreciate about this novel is the way it just has this real love for music and this love of joy, and it's just, there's so much that's so joyous within this book. But it almost offers that as having to exist to be a counterpoint to some of the much harsher realities of life as well. Another new release I read is Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. And I've been meaning to read something by him for years, because I think The Gallows Pole and Men's Tears and a few other books were ones that I kept on sort of seeing around and kept on wanting to read. And Cuddy deals a lot with right in the north of England, and particularly the sort of tales of St. Cuthbert. And whereas at first that doesn't sound like it'd be the most appealing thing to, you know, in a book to be sort of focused on a very specific saint from a very long time ago, what I think is really quite profound about this book is the way that it deals with this sense of place and belonging. So in talking about the myths and sort of legends and everything around St. Cuthbert, we enter into a much bigger conversation about the role of some of those stories in how we think about our sense of belonging and our identities. So actually this idea there's a real rootedness of place that comes with this. And the stories of St. Cuthbert should be there as a way for people in that area, sort of around Durham and kind of nearby, to really feel this sense of awe about the place they live in and about Durham Cathedral and about so many other things. But actually the sort of modern day, and one of the narratives that we see in this book is a more modern day one, where people are basically doing manual labour to sort of make ends meet and to try and escape this area, or make enough to sort of just about be comfortable. And there's this discussion about sort of changing demographics. So people from Eastern Europe coming in, doing manual labour and sending money back home, and how some of those people might settle and make sort of Durham and the surrounds their home. Some of them might not. And that's all well and good. But actually, in the meantime, there's this sort of discussion about, well, actually, if everybody is only in Durham and only doing this work to make money in order to leave or make money for people elsewhere, then actually this sort of idea of what Durham is and sort of what this local area means, these myths, these tales, seems to be almost a little lost. So I think this book really grapples with this idea of, you know, this cathedral was built out, you know, for this idea of having this sense of awe and to bury St. Cuthbert. And instead, it's sort of a place that people pass by and maybe do some manual work to maintain, to make, you know, a bit of money. And so it's this sort of interesting thing about how we shape our local areas and how they shape us. And I think there's something so brilliant about the way this book deals with local dialect and with identity. I think it's just really beautifully done. And I think potentially could be a contender to be on the book along list. It kind of has that feel to it. But I think either way, just a very beautiful book. And I really appreciated the way it thinks about identity as something so rooted in the sense of place, but also something so malleable and changeable over time as well. A book that kind of deals with something similar, although I don't think quite as successfully, unfortunately, was Radioactivity by John Murray, a Cumbrian tale in 5 emissions. And the idea is sort of that there's this radio being played, and sort of essentially we're reading somebody who's taken a transcript and has then written the book around it. So sort of several layers of sort of meta or kind of what have you. And I think on the surface, parts of this are quite funny and quite clever. You know, it deals with this really strong Cumbrian dialect, so not massively far away from the world of Cuddy in terms of its sort of location. But what I think this book does less successfully is it almost feels a little bit it almost feels like it's going for a little bit of a cheap laugh, I think, at times for me, unfortunately. So I think earlier on there are some jokes that I think landed quite well and I thought were quite funny, that, you know, you've got this character speaking this really strong dialect that almost nobody understands, but also he's learnt fluent Arabic, and every time he goes to talk about Cumbria, people think he's kind of interject and think he's about to say this place in Iran, or, you know, he's sort of, there are these sort of ongoing little jokes and they kind of grow and change over the course of the book. But I think overall, I just found it a little bit too reliant on trying to make jokes all the time. I think I just wanted more of a solid narrative going on beneath it. And obviously not every book has to do that. Comic novels exist for a reason as well. But I just don't think it was particularly successful for me on that front. Also on my book of nonsense, I read David Malouf's Remembering Babylon, which was shortlisted a good while ago. And the idea in this book is that there is a young boy who, as part of this sort of voyage at one point, moving within sort of towards Australia, he gets washed up on shore and is basically sort of taken in by an Aboriginal sort of indigenous group, and they look after him, they bring him up, and so then he becomes this, when sort of later you know, other people from the UK or other people from sort of white Australia find him, they kind of can't quite understand how there's this white man, but he looks and behaves like an Aborigine in some ways. And it sort of deals a lot with the politics of that actually, you know, he represents a threat to their understanding of themselves, because, you know, if it's you know, and particularly the prevailing sort of myth and thought at the time of the book, the sort of 1800s, is that, you know, Aboriginals were inherently different in terms of sort of, you know, they could never have the same behaviours as white folk or what have you. And so this book deals with that idea, because suddenly you've got this this white man who behaves like an Aborigine because he grew up around them to some degree, or he has some kind of traits. And so that challenges that very concept to them, that it's a question of, you know, nature or nurture and all that, those sorts of things. So the book kind of deals with that. And although I think it kind of was over a little bit too quickly almost for me, I think I maybe wanted a little bit more development of some of the ideas within it. I did really appreciate the way this book is sort of trying to threaten and challenge those ideas, and to sort of, you know, particularly given that it's set in the, you know, the washing up on shore incident happens in the 1840s in the book, and this book coming out, you know, over 100 years later is dealing with how some of those thoughts are still quite prevalent. And so I thought it was really interesting for that as well. Then we get on to the Women's Prize. So first up, I read Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, which I really enjoyed. I thought the way this book deals with musicality is really interesting. So a key part of this book is this sort of music scene and it's sort of this woman who is sort of this MC kind of figure and sort of bringing herself up during, you know, part of the music scene. And there are some echoes with the author's life. I thought the way that this book approaches this was really clever, in the same way that Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson just has this deep love and reverence for music. That comes through so strongly within Fire Rush, of just this absolute joy and love for music and its power to bring us out of ourselves, to help us imagine new futures and new realities for ourselves and all those sorts of things. So I think this book kind of deals with it in a really interesting way, not only because it has these little snatches of songs or what have you in it, and is obviously so much about music, but it also a large part of it is in sort of dialect and accent, and there's a sort of musicality and rhythm to that as well that's really compelling in the book that I wasn't actually expecting to enjoy it quite as much as I did. I thought it was I was just really, it was quite a sort of an easy book to read and just spend a lot of time in, because it's such an engaging plot of talking about the sort of difficulties this woman has of starting to venture further and further into a life and into a world that is quite scary, that seems at first like it's going to destroy her in some way, and then her sort of trying to find a way to navigate all of that. So I just thought it was a really interesting book. Yeah, and it sort of made me think differently about who is maybe in my top for the Women's Prize as well. I'll do a separate video on my thoughts about the whole shortlist, but really interesting book. And last but not least, and another Women's Prize shortlistee, Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. And this book deals a lot with war and conflict, particularly around what would be basically sort of modern day. Well, it's between many of the nations that sort of have changed borders and changed names, but ostensibly around sort of Bosnia, Serbia, and sort of many kind of neighbouring countries, and particularly sort of Bosnia, sort of modern day Bosnia. And so it deals a lot with the conflict that happens, and particularly at the heart of it, our character Zora, who is this painter, and she becomes sort of famous within the area for kind of painting bridges. And obviously you can sort of smell a literary technique coming a mile off in that sense, but in a really positive way. You know, this idea of she is very adept at painting bridges, and she sort of becomes famous for this, but she decides that she really doesn't want to paint anymore. And there are some notes at the back of this book that talk about how it was modelled on a famous painter who equally sort of, when war started and when he was sort of forced to move where he lived, decided that he couldn't kind of countenance the idea of painting anymore and put his paintbrushes down for a really long time. And so equally in this book, we're dealing with a lot of that conflict and a lot of the difficulties of these characters trying to work out what they do. But really, at the heart of it, we've got these sort of the ways that characters try to keep sane within this war, and the ways that they keep on trying to find a way to just be and to exist in a slightly more comfortable way. It's deeply difficult for them within the sort of trenches of war within their cities, because they notice how things change day by day, how there are some temporary structures that are put up overnight to try and divide off areas of Sarajevo into, you know, a Muslim area or a Serbian area or whatever else. And in the morning, everybody takes those down and sort of carries on with their day. But slowly, those divides seem to become bigger and bigger, that you know, there are whole areas of the city that are seen as being a certain neighborhood only, and equally some of those things complicate this idea. You know, so Zora spends so much of the book thinking of Sarajevo as this melting pot of a place, but then she realizes that Sarajevo has also been divided and has these complications where even people within the city can't see that for what it is. You know, they will still look at a Serbian neighbor or a Muslim neighbor and see them as being separate from who they are. So really beautifully told, I think, as a book as well. And I really greatly enjoyed this. And I think that takes me to the end of the books I read this week. It's been an interesting and fun one. I've sort of dipped into some other books as well as I've gone throughout the week, which I shall be talking about soon. But really, yeah, really great to read some of these. And I hope you have had a good reading week. I shall speak to you all soon. Have a good one. Take care. And yeah, talk to you all soon. Bye.